Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again this week from Houston in Texas. Well, the head of Human Rights Watch has called Donald Trump's time in office, quote, 4 years of abuse of democratic principles, end quote. He's urged President-elect Biden to restore the country's credibility both at home and abroad vis-a-vis human rights. He's also called for Biden to re-engage with the UN Human Rights Council, even though, of course, there are U.S. concerns about perceived unfair criticism of Israel, something that I'm not going to get into directly, of course, in this conversation necessarily. Let's discuss all those issues a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Glenn Mitoma, who is the director of the Dodd Human Rights Impact and assistant professor of human rights and education at the University of Connecticut. He's joining us this morning from Mansfield, Connecticut. Joining us this morning from Syracuse, New York, is Dr. Grant Davis Reeher, who is a professor of political science. He's also director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship. Grant and Glenn, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Glenn, let me start with you. What do you make of Donald Trump's track record when it comes to human rights, both at home and abroad?
Thank you, Waqar. It's great to be with you. Frankly, it's a disaster. I think this has been an unprecedented retreat from the U.S.'s traditional engagement with human rights. It's worth remembering that the U.S. was at the forefront of the development of the international human rights system after the Second World War. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by a UN committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and the commitment, which was admittedly largely rhetorical rather than real to human rights that the U.S. Engaged in was an important element of the post-war global framework. And Donald Trump's embrace of dictators abroad and embrace of authoritarian practices at home have really hollowed out the sense that the U.S. is a human rights leader in the world. So rebuilding that, I think, is going to take an enormous commitment from the Biden administration, from the top down, and should be really rooted in frankly, domestic policy as well as foreign policy.
Grant, what are your thoughts on that? What were your thoughts on how Donald Trump has impacted the U.S. image vis-a-vis human rights, both at home and around the world?
Well, I would agree with almost all of what Glenn has said. The only two things I would add as, I guess, friendly amendments to his thesis is that he mentioned the distinction between reality and rhetoric. And I think one of the main problems for Donald Trump as a president in terms of human rights was his rhetoric in particular. That's not to say that there weren't problems with the policies as well, but I think the rhetoric is where we really saw some of the most outrageous things that came out of the White House. The other thing I think I would just note briefly is that if we're talking about contradictions and inconsistencies in American foreign policy in terms of human rights, you'd be searching long and hard to find an administration that didn't have those.
Glenn, we can probably, go into many specifics, right? But I mean, in general, if I may for a moment take a macro look at this issue and not just talk about Donald Trump, but then in a post 9/11 world, in a world of war on terror, I would think that there would be many human rights experts around the world who would not look very kindly upon the U.S. human rights record, even before Donald Trump. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely, yes. No, the retreat from human rights has been a long-term project, frankly. I think the presidency of George W. Bush did enormous damage to the credibility of the United States as an advocate for human rights. They deployed the rhetoric of democracy and human rights as a justification for the invasion of Iraq, but clearly, with historic perspective, we can see that much of that was a lie. Frankly, not only a lie, but the results of that invasion were an enormous human rights catastrophe. And even under the Obama administration, there was no full-throated embrace of a human rights policy. Notoriously, he retreated from that language as a fundamental pillar of his foreign policy as well. So Donald Trump, in many ways, is and this is true not just of the kind of post 9/11 world, but really of our entire history. He's the culmination of the worst impulses of the American experience with human rights writ large. So it's absolutely the case that this has been a long time in the making and not simply the result of the past 4 years.
Indeed, Grant, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, this is something that's been a concern, as I said to Glenn, for human rights experts around the world. I don't know, I can point at so many events, right? Abu Ghraib, for example, comes to mind, but I'm sure there are many, many others in this list that we can probably come up with our minds. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I'm hearing things that I largely agree with. I think just it's important, though, to note as well that when we look at some of the other countries in the Western world who have also been heavily engaged in international affairs, there are mixed track records there. That's not to excuse the things that the United States has done. The other qualifying thing I would put on it is that the United States is in a unique position in the world, and it is looked to as the world's policeman, so to speak. It is the leading superpower in the world, and it has entanglements and engagements all around the world. And I think that complicates things sometimes. And so you have to make some difficult decisions, and sometimes you enter into contradictions between things that are in your long-term strategic interest versus the respect of human rights. And so, again, that's not meant to excuse some of these things, but I think it's just meant to put them in a different context. Some of the countries with sterling records on human rights, frankly, don't have the burdens in the world that the United States does, or the necessity of being involved in different places.
And that's a fair point, isn't it, Glenn, where the U.S. is certainly in a unique position as a superpower and as a country that many others around the world do look up to, even in regards to human rights. But then, if we're leading by example, then in this case, then if I may pick on one example of what the U.S. has done recently, is that of blocking an ICC investigation and blocking, even the prosecutor from traveling to the U.S. to gather information about U.S. troops' activities, for example, in Afghanistan. Why not have international bodies also having oversight over U.S. activities so that we are leading by good example in the world?
That's a great point. And again, Donald Trump has taken to an extreme, a kind of long-term trend in American policy of American exceptionalism with regard to international institutions and mechanisms. The U.S. is the only country in the world to have failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for instance. And so, and that wasn't simply because Donald Trump refused to ratify it. No president has been able to see it through a Senate ratification process since it was originally drafted in 1989. So it's certainly true that the United States regards itself as exceptional, and it's certainly true to some extent that it is, given its power and its influence around the world. I will say, the diminution of that power and influence, though, is a double-edged sword. And while it exposes it to the possibility of being caught in contradictions with regard to human rights, it also means that it has opportunities to exercise leadership to advance human rights. I suspect that if Donald Trump had not been president—
All right, so Grant, if I may bring it now within U.S. borders, right? We have had BLM, Black Lives Matter protests within the country as well, and the world has watched as to how the response to those sorts of protests have been as well. And many times quite harsh responses as well. And, for largely, I would think that, of course, peaceful protests have continued also, so that, there's both sides of that coin. But do you think that the U.S. did lose some credibility, again, internationally, because of the way it has responded to that sort of very important protest movement?
Yes, and I think in that regard, that is something that the president has to bear most of the responsibility for in terms of how we are perceived from the outside, because there was really no leadership there. That leads to a point that I would make for our international standing, just to go back to that really quickly. One of the good things here is that Joe Biden is going to enter into this with a lot of goodwill around the world and a lot of high expectations, just like Barack Obama did. in 2008. And so that I think will help. But there is no question that this president has done a number of things and, more importantly, said a number of things that have really hurt our standing around the world. And those things are consistent with some of the things that he has done within the country. It's not a good track record on democracy, and it's not a good track record on human rights more generally. And so I think the country is ready to turn the page, frankly, and we'll see what the month of February brings.
Glenn, if I may go to that point that Grant there just made about, Joe Biden coming in with a lot of positive energy and positive expectations of him, not just from Americans, but from around the world. And he mentioned Barack Obama because, under Barack Obama, too, there was police brutality, right? That still happened under his watch. Now, how he dealt with it, of course, we can debate. But do you think that even Americans, to an extent, might be questioning what their human rights standings really are?
Yes, I teach at a university that has a robust undergraduate human rights program. I do a lot of outreach in the community around human rights, and prior to the last few years, typically I would go out and talk about human rights, and people would want to talk about issues unfolding abroad in Syria or China or Russia. These days we go out there and people want to talk about what's going on at home. I think we really do have a moment of reflection in which, perhaps the era of American exceptionalism is over, and many of us are realizing that we are part of the world, and that those mechanisms, policies, principles, and practices that form the heart of the international human rights system should apply here as much as anywhere. That's true with respect to police brutality, but of course we're living through the coronavirus pandemic, and I think the devastating impact that's had on individuals and communities around the country can be directly tied to our overall failure to protect the right to health in this country. And so Joe Biden really does have an opportunity in responding to the multiple layers of crises that this country faces to do so through a human rights lens and a human rights framework. I think it offers a lot for federal policy, but it also offers a lot for state and local policy. So we'll see. As Grant says, what February brings. But certainly from the perspective of those activists and grassroots advocates on the ground who mobilized over the summer to support Black lives, and certainly for many for whom the coronavirus has not only meant a health crisis but an economic crisis, a really ambitious restructuring of many elements of American society, I think are a possibility today in a way they weren't 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Very well, Glenn and Grant, we'll have to leave it there at that. The clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both of you taking your time out to speak to us today here in Scope. We were talking there about the head of Human Rights Watch, essentially saying that during Trump's time in office, he's abused democratic principles and has hurt human rights both at home and abroad. And we've discussed various aspects of that, certainly U.S. foreign policy, even before Donald Trump, U.S. domestic policy and human rights issues, even before Donald Trump as well. So it's not like these are things that are just limited to the person of Donald Trump. And maybe that is a conversation which is, in fact, more important to be having as well, the direction, the slide, if I may say, of human rights in the U.S. and its then role around the world in that regard. Also, very important debate to be having because again, the U.S. is a superpower, as Grant there had correctly mentioned, and does then bear extra responsibility on its shoulders to lead by good example if it so claims to have the moral authority that it does. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment right after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, all of us, those of us who use WhatsApp, and that's probably the vast majority of those people watching this right now, got that notification, didn't we, about having to accept privacy terms. And there was no opt-out option, really. And if you did choose to opt out, you'd essentially lose access to the app at some point very soon. Now, that And those changes to the privacy terms mean that more of the data will be shared with WhatsApp's parent company, Facebook, and that has then increased concerns about privacy overall, because we know that Facebook has had many issues with privacy in the past as well. There has now been then an exodus, seemingly, to other rival apps such as Telegram and Signal, and there probably are others, more local ones, depending on which country we're talking about. Are we all overreacting, or is this a fair concern at this time? One wonders, even for myself, as a journalist, do we need to be a lot more careful anyhow? And we have had to be anyhow with encryptions and all of the above, but this is a whole other ballgame, seemingly at this point, where we're now connecting the data to a much larger tech company such as Facebook altogether. Let's discuss that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Selepak, who is program coordinator in master's program with specialization in social media. He's also a lecturer at the Department of Telecommunication. He is affiliated with the University of Florida. He's joining us this morning from Gainesville, Florida. Andrew, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. As I put in my introduction there, Andrew, do you think we're all overreacting? Because this has been this alarm, the global alarm about what this all means for our privacy.
I think the biggest part is that the alarm is late. This is something that people should have been concerned about 4 years ago, when Facebook basically announced that they were going to be changing how they were going to be collecting data to begin with. So what we're seeing now is just kind of an extension of that, and sort of a preview of the future, when we're pretty sure that WhatsApp will continue to collect more data on us as Facebook combines this platform with Instagram and Facebook.
So then, what's the solution then? Do you think Telegram and Signal, for example, I don't want to talk about company specifics necessarily, but do you think that they offer better alternatives?
Well, we've seen Elon Musk basically suggest to everybody to switch over to Signal. The biggest problem is that it just doesn't have the same user base, and you're going to see a lot of people who will be upset. Who will say that they're going to stop using WhatsApp, that might even delete WhatsApp temporarily. But as we've seen time and time again in the past, when people get upset about any of these privacy concerns with the Facebook-owned social media apps, they go back to them. And that's really the big thing. Facebook is essentially kind of betting on the fact that, as upset as some people might get, they'll go back to using WhatsApp. The big thing that we might see is that if something happens out of the EU, and if the EU kind of forces Facebook's hand, as they have slightly in the past, but for the most part, Facebook understands, and they have the realization that most people will go back to using WhatsApp, and this will just give them a greater opportunity to monetize the app. Still not to the extent of Facebook or Instagram, but to start making more money and more profits off of people using WhatsApp.
And then, Andrea, as you well know, there are a number of antitrust cases against Facebook and a number of other big tech companies as well. Do you think this strengthens the argument in that regard? Because it again goes to show that maybe these tech companies are simply too big for the good of the rest of us.
I think what we're looking at now is that Facebook is just this huge company, and most people just don't realize the breadth and depth of the company in terms of how many apps that they control and the amount of data that's being collected. I've been saying for quite some time now that I really don't believe here in the United States and in other countries around the world that they're going to, the politics and the governments are going to take enough steps to really regulate this without a groundswell from the people. And that's why any news stories and any coverage of the amount of data that's being collected, how that data is being used, and who's profiting off of it is really important, because it's getting this information to the people, and hopefully they will then become motivated to really demand of their politicians more regulation, more changes. Will we see Facebook be broken up? Will they be forced to sell Instagram? I'm not sure. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is just how much money Facebook has, and to the extent that they can tie up any litigation in the courts. But really, until people become upset enough and demand it of their politicians and their elected officials, I think it's going to be some time before we see any true change.
Social media, Andrew, as you know as well, was meant to be this, this amazing place for an exchange of ideas, and it, for a large part, it served that purpose, right? At least in the beginning days. But now we all have our own echo chambers, our own little bubbles on social media, anyhow. But in that regard of social media and regulations, as you mentioned, also, do you think, and why do you think, in fact, let me put it this way, why do you think it is that even the international community. I don't want to just hone in on the US, but why have politicians and policymakers not realized that this needed to be regulated even really from day one?
I think part of it was this kind of hope or this belief for most places, say outside of China, was that social media was going to be this great communicative tool, and it was going to allow people from different communities and different backgrounds to interact, to engage, to share ideas. And there was a great hope for it. What we've seen is that it has become this sort of tech symbiotic relationship with governments, to where we know politicians, we know government agencies, we know national governments use these platforms. This is how they get their messages out now. This is how they reach people. This is how they reach people across the world. And I think because there's this connection now for politicians and governments through these social media apps to their constituents, to people in their communities, to people around the world, it's become such a sort of link between the two that it would be very hard for them to separate and for them to really distinguish what they would use. Going back to traditional media, it just seems like it would be very difficult for them to do at this point. Then there's also the amount of money that these tech companies have and how they can contribute money to campaigns, to different causes, to different issues. And then we as consumers who in just, essentially a decade have become so addicted to the platforms. They've kind of created a business model that is very difficult for anybody to compete with.
Andrew, the argument that comes up often, and I've heard this very, very often, is that, listen, if you have nothing to hide, if you're not doing anything wrong, then why should you worry about what these companies have vis-a-vis info on you?
And there's a lot of people who could make the argument, well, if I have nothing to hide, what should I worry about if they're collecting my data? And, there is maybe some truth to that. But at the same time, we wouldn't have the same ideas with more traditional media. If we knew that there was a company going through our mail, we would be very concerned about that. If we knew that there was a company listening to our phone calls, we'd be very concerned about that. It's just that in this very brief amount of time, we've somehow just kind of brought ourselves to this point where we just kind of accept that this is going on when we go online and we use social media or when we use the web. But at the same time, we also have to understand that there are lots of people out there who don't understand that. They don't understand the extent that their information is being collected, it's being used, that with these billionaires are profiting off of our information and how we go online and who we talk to, when we talk to them, what we search for, what we do. And a lot of this comes down to needing to educate the public. If the public is not informed, they're blissfully unaware to some extent. And that's really the situation that we found ourselves in now, where, too many people in the public simply don't know, aren't aware, and maybe to even some extent don't care. But until they're educated, until they're informed, until they're brought more aware of the situation, again, we're going to be in this situation for some time.
So then one wonders then, and you've already alluded to this in your earlier answer about what happens next, right? Because if I may use an argument that was used for banks during the financial crunch, was that they're too big to fail, right? Some of them. So do you think that it's almost like these companies, if they were to collapse, that would almost, or be broken up, that would almost be a bad thing?
I think the biggest thing is that with Facebook, you can't take your data with you. If you talk about a bank, you conceivably can take your money with you. But when it comes to Facebook, we've been using it going back over a decade, and we've made posts, we've posted pictures, we've shared so many status updates. And if there was a rival that was to come out right now, if somebody was to create a potential Facebook killer, and lots of people have tried, from Google Plus to LO and so forth, you can't take all of that information with you. I think if that was allowed, if that was required, if that was a possibility, we could maybe see something. But at this point, people just don't want to give up with the familiar. They don't want to lose the thing that they have grown so accustomed to. And we also have to keep in mind that they've grown accustomed to it on that cell phone, that smartphone that they look at in the morning when they wake up, they look at night before they go to bed, that's in their pocket, that is with them 24/7. Social media and our phones have become such an extension of who we are. It becomes very difficult for us to even contemplate losing that. And that makes it also very difficult for people to think about making any type of switch.
So then, and this, these companies have huge political impact as well, right? And I don't want to go into very specific politics, but, WhatsApp, we know there was issues with, and still are issues with forwarded messages, fake news, all that kind of stuff. If we're talking about information, wouldn't it have been better? I mean, for WhatsApp to have tackled misinformation instead of, trying to share more of the user information, you would think that they would try to get their priorities right in this cases, wouldn't you?
Well, the one thing is because of the encryption, we don't expect that Facebook is going to be looking at the actual messages in WhatsApp. So, from that perspective, it's much more difficult for them to be able to kind of regulate, change, or do anything when it comes to fake news being spread on the platform. Obviously, that's different from Instagram or Facebook, where they have access to all the messages that are public. Facebook Messenger, another part of the sort of Facebook ecosystem, is slightly different as well. You would think that Facebook would be trying to do more to combat fake news, to try to combat false information that's being spread. But at the end of the day, Facebook is a business. Their goal is to make money. Their goal is not necessarily to prevent, stop, or regulate fake news. Mark Zuckerberg is not one of the richest people in the world because he spent a lot of time being very concerned about fake news being spread. He's one of the richest people in the world because he spent a lot more time making sure that he profits. And what we're seeing right now with WhatsApp and the potential for WhatsApp in terms of more information being collected and shared back to Facebook, this is just to line the pockets of Zuckerberg, shareholders, and the executives at Facebook. It's not about making the app better for us. It's not making the app better for users. It's, again, about monetizing an app for Zuckerberg, for Facebook, and for the executives at the company.
Just as a final comment, and under a minute if you can, Andrew, this is not the end of WhatsApp, I would imagine.
No, I mean, again, there's too many users that are on WhatsApp. People aren't going to leave the app in such mass droves that will probably cause any changes. Now, is it possible? Yes, anything's possible. Will we see one of the other apps overtake it in terms of user base? No, they're just too far behind. We're looking at, a couple million compared to over 1 billion on WhatsApp. So we're not going to see WhatsApp suddenly disappear off of our phones. It's not going to be suddenly not used anymore. For a time, people might use it less, but we're going to see it kind of go back to where it is until there really is a tremendous groundswell of people basically requiring their governments for them to make a change and add more regulation.
Very well, Andrea, we'll leave that as our final comment, but we appreciate you taking your time out this morning to speak to us from Gainesville, Florida, sharing your thoughts there on WhatsApp and, the privacy concerns that have now come out and have caused global concern. Critics and activist viewers are now saying that new terms, because they do share more data now with the parent company, Facebook, that this means that more of our data is going into an uncertain atmosphere where it may very well be misused by this company. As Andrew there said, the main goal here is essentially to line the pockets of these big tech companies' executives, right? So Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg is no different from anybody else who wants to make more money, even though he has lots of it already. And so if it's a question of him selling our data to make such money, he is more than willing to do so. And again, on the face of it, as a businessman, it makes complete sense. Why haven't governments, though, around the world regulated this properly? Why hasn't there been more concern even before this? Because there were already concerns about WhatsApp even before this entire incident took place, and certainly about Facebook altogether also. It seems that we are all also very careless when it comes to our own privacy and are not demanding enough of our respective governments in response to many of these concerns that continue to be raised year on year, month on month, day on day. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my final segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss drought. Now, researchers are predicting that by the end of the century, the availability of fresh water, more specifically, is on track to decline sharply across the world by the end of the century, with the number of people exposed to extreme drought doubling. The projected shortfalls of water were specifically alarming in various areas around the world, including parts of the U.S., the Amazon River Basin, Southern Africa, Australia, the Mediterranean region as well. What are the reasons for this? Climate change, certainly, as we know, is becoming extremely and increasingly important, of course, and we are seeing the effects of it around the world with various weather patterns in places which were not expected to be occurring in that fashion as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Andrea Momblanch, who is an academic fellow in water systems modeling at Cranfield Water Science Institute. She's joining us now from Cranfield in the UK. Andrea, thank you very much for your time today. Let us start with the basics if we can. Why do you think we are having this sort of extreme drought?
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, climate change is playing a big part in how those large-scale climate processes are evolving, and we are seeing that the extreme events are increasing, not only droughts but also floodings. So it's basically that change in the balance between temperature and rainfall seasonality what is producing these longer periods of lack of rain with higher temperatures that are the origin of meteorological drought and hydrological drought, and then operational drought. That is the one that ultimately affects people.
On that point of flooding that you mentioned, because to me, and this might sound like an ignorant question, so pardon me, but with climate change, we're expecting obviously global temperatures to increase, right? So that means more ice will melt. So it seemed logical to always talk about flooding, but then drought doesn't seem to be following that same logic, at least for me. I mean, what are we missing in that puzzle piece then?
Well, the thing is that we have always had droughts in specific places. You mentioned the Mediterranean, in which every 10 years we used to have like 4 years drought period. Now everything is intensifying in frequency, and so droughts come more frequently, and whenever they come, they last longer. The origin for that, it's unclear yet, I'm afraid. So there is a lot of research ongoing to find out what are the causes for those more extreme drought events. So yeah, I'm afraid I cannot give you a clear scientific response for that yet.
All right, so let's talk about solutions then, Andrea, because I know for many years we've had countries such as the United Arab Emirates and others who have been seeding clouds for rainfall. Is that a potential solution?
Well, yeah, that's true that we have started to engineer our climate, and we can seed clouds to generate rainfall, and we can do the opposite. We can disperse those clouds if we want it. But I think even though that could be a path, we have to think about so drought is a natural event, and it can be now changing its frequency and magnitude due to anthropogenic changes to climate. We know that. But when you combine the drought with how people use water and when they need water and how much water they need, is when the problem of water scarcity appears, and that is what affects us. So that means that we have the control over that way in which we use the water, in how we irrigate, for example, how efficient our distribution systems are in the cities, how we are producing our energy or using the water in our industry. So even though we can act on the side of water availability, it is also, and I suppose much easier to act, well, much easier, that's probably a statement too easy to say, but yeah, it's in our hands to change the water demand side of the equation in a way that we balance better the needs of water with the availability of water that we have in the future. And I think that is the way forward to give an answer to the future problems of water scarcity and droughts.
Because we're talking here about specifically about fresh water, right? But what about salt water and other forms of water which are not necessarily in their original form good enough for human consumption? I mean, I would think that there are processes, of course, I'm sure there are processes in place to be able to convert that into fresh water, right? So I mean, should that be then sped up?
Well, definitely we should try to think about alternative water sources or ways of capturing more water. We, of course, can start reusing water from wastewater treatment for agriculture, and that is a practice that is implemented safely with all the implications of the microorganisms and things that wastewater has, but it is being implemented safely in many countries at the moment. Then, of course, we have desalination that for coastal areas it's a solution, but we also have more ancestral practices, let's say. And for example, in the high mountains of Asia, the Himalayas and Karakoram, traditionally the communities have had their ways of harvesting water or storing it. So, for example, there is something called the horizontal rainfall, that is that fog or that humidity that develops in high mountains, and you can with vertical devices capture that humidity, condensate it, and use it for your local irrigation, etc. So there is a lot to learn from more ancestral knowledge, and like looking backwards to what our ancestors did that could be useful nowadays to get that extra amount of water that can make a difference for our quality of life.
On the topic of rainfall, it's also important, isn't it? Rainfall also is extremely important for places where there's extreme pollution, right? Because it cleans the air in many ways, right? It helps to an extent, at least for a while after rainfall, to clean the air. This is then a vicious cycle, isn't it? Where pollution then is responsible for climate change to a very large extent, and then that then results in less rainfall and then more pollution. I mean, this is sort of like this cycle which we're stuck in, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. I think that we are in a point that we are retrofitting those processes. And I think that, of course, we can act on generating more water resources with alternative ways or alternative strategies. We can work on the water supply, but ultimately what we have to realize is that we have to stop polluting our world, our climate, our air. Because I mean, this is like a car going at high speed. If you lift your foot from the accelerator, the car won't stop immediately. So it has some inertia, and it will take some time for the changes that we make today to reflect on any improvement on the pollution of our atmosphere. So we need to stop the sooner the better, and it's starting to be very urgent that we act on that side, on the cause of it all, let's say, to prevent further damage in the future, or irreversible even.
Very well, Andrea. We'll have to leave that as a final comment, but we sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us and to put that all into context for us. That was Dr. Andrea Momblanch speaking to us there from Cranfield in the UK. Climate politics and just climate change as a whole are becoming increasingly important. For those who have not yet realized their importance, it will be to their own detriment to not have dealt with climate change head on. And now drought, as we've spoken of in this show, is extremely important also because, this will affect freshwater supplies for people who, and, human beings need fresh water, right, to be able to drink and to consume as well. So extreme droughts around the world, though drought in and of itself is a natural phenomenon, the levels of which we're seeing at and the doubling of it over the next century or so is a very, very worrying sign. We'll certainly keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.